You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your logical host, Abraham.
And I'm your skeptical host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do and how we feel, and sometimes how we feel about how we think. And that's what we do. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, hopefully today you walk out of this questioning everything you've ever believed.
That's right. Yeah, the whole point of today's episode is to cause existential panic. Just kidding.
Aha! And look at that. We can do that with words. Isn't that fun?
Indeed. So anyway, as I said, thank you for joining us. If you are here with us for the very first time, we appreciate you being here. If you would like to support what you hear us doing today, you can join us on Patreon, pick up some merch, leave us a rating and review, like, subscribe, share, do all the things. But first, I'd like to wish you happy Eat an Extra Dessert Day.
My nutritionist would be so mad at me if I did that. It is Global Talent Acquisition Day.
It is also National Macadamia Nut Day. Oh, I love macadamia nuts. Have you had macadamia nuts?
Oh, I have. I love them, and I'm going to be in Hawaii next week. I guess at the time that this comes out, I'll be in Hawaii, so I'll be having so many of them.
Very much. Yeah, very good. Love those.
Yeah. It's National Wildlife Day, so take care of all those coyotes and armadillos and possums and insects and lizards and all the things that are around you that are not domesticated.
Right. Newspaper Carrier Day. Also, care for the newspaper carrier.
Yes, please do. Give them water. It is World Sexual Health Day, which I really love. Go get tested.
Indeed. It is Indigenous Literacy Day. This seems like a really good one.
That feels good. It's National Cogeneration Day.
Apparently has to do with generating heat and power at the same time.
I like it.
To just be more efficient. Yeah. It is International Enthusiasm Week. You can tell by how enthusiastic I said that. You did it better than I did.
Listen, we did it together. That's where we're at. It's Zero Waste Week, which I like.
Yeah.
No pooping.
That's right. None of that. It is National Childhood Injury Prevention Week. So make all of your child's clothes bubble wrap this week.
Yeah, put pool noodles on the corners of all the corners in your house so that nobody falls and gets hurt. It's National Nutrition Week.
Finally.
Yeah.
It is National Payroll Week. See, I thought I had a lot more of those. So no one told my employers that this is the one week.
Yeah. I don't want to get paid annually. It is National Waffle Week, which I love that.
Yeah, fantastic. It is Self-University Week. Is this just like self-education? Is that the idea?
I think that's the idea. I hope that's not like the entire idea. Like, I think that, educating yourself is great, but maybe calling yourself a university might be a problem.
The University of Me.
Yes. I am the only student enrolled, and now I owe myself financial aid. It is Sobriety Checkpoint Week, which is really great. I love that.
Sure. Importantly, it is Hispanic Heritage Month. Yay.
Yay, starting on September 15th through October 15th. So please, please, please celebrate and enjoy. It is Sourdough September. So may your bread be crusty.
Yeah, Sourdough February just does not have the same ring to it.
Yeah, that's true.
Alopecia Areata Awareness Month. There's been a lot of awareness brought to alopecia more recently, I feel like.
Yeah, I feel like I'm definitely more aware of it than I was before. It is National Spinal Cord Injury Awareness Month as well.
A lot of movies like to pretend that those don't happen when they throw people into ridiculous situations where they should definitely not have walked away unscathed, but they did.
Yeah, just about every superhero should be paralyzed.
Yeah. It is National Sickle Cell Awareness Month. That's another very important one.
Yes, absolutely. It's also National Suicide Prevention Month. Incredibly important.
Definitely. And last, but certainly not least, and maybe the most important thing, or the only important thing you hear us say today in this whole entire episode, is that it's Beyonce's birthday.
Queen Bey.
So get on the social medias and send a birthday message or just celebrate privately. I don't know, whatever.
Do whatever you do for Beyonce's birthday. Whatever makes you happy and whatever serves the queen,
So as I said, we like to talk about psychology things, although we do list the various holidays that people have come up with for fun, because there are so many of them, and some of them are very silly. Some of them are very important, and it's a thing that happens. But we are here to talk about thinking. And in this discussion, we are primarily tackling the idea of critical thinking, something that many listeners, if not most, if not all, will hear and think, well, that seems like a very important topic because it seems to exist in a lot less than we would like it to in the world.
Yes. Yes.
We're here to try and help a little bit with that for, the people who hear us and maybe share us with the people who need to hear this. But I think the important part of this is that we're going to be trying to define critical thinking. We're going to try and point out some how-tos to be better at critical thinking and also highlight some easy pitfalls where mistakes can be made.
Absolutely. So let's start with, like we always like to do, with a nice definition and some background. And in order to get into anything else that we're talking about, we have to understand what critical thinking is. So critical thinking is a specific behavior that involves analyzing information by considering the facts, the evidence, the arguments, the observations, and the coherence of information to evaluate the quality of that information. So basically, critical thinking requires you to take a lot of bits of information together and decide whether or not that bit of information is actually quality and useful.
Yeah, we hear some kind of argument, claim, statement, rhetoric that is portrayed, and we start trying to weigh that in terms of how useful or accurate that piece of information is. Like what can we take away from this piece of information, if anything? And the critical part of critical thinking, if you are less familiar with this term, it kind of sounds negative. Say like critical thinking, I don't want to be critical.
No.
I mean, in a way it is negative because it is a strategy for subtracting out the incorrect and unnecessary information. But really all we mean here is critical means evaluating the merits and the weaknesses of something. Usually in this case, we're talking about like arguments and claims that people make.
Right. So this is a very complex behavior and depends on a lot of other skills to kind of make it happen. And those skills require practice and sometimes even direct training. So you might have to be explicitly taught how to do some of these behaviors.
Very much so. I mean, the tendency for us is kind of bias. And I don't mean bias I think a lot of people hear bias and immediately think racism. That is certainly a form of bias, but mostly we have bias in terms of our tendencies to think and believe certain things quickly without really judging them by sort of carefully weighing the quality of those things.
Right.
And we bring bias with us everywhere. And it's best to know what our biases are and how they can happen so that when we can understand how our opinions about things might be being shaped sort of automatically.
Right.
An important aspect to all of this too is the implication here is this is something that takes some work to do. And it seems to be the case that this is not something we do very naturally, that we don't just do it.
Right.
We have to practice it. We have to be taught it. We have to learn how to apply it. Neil deGrasse Tyson made this point. He said, quote, "I am convinced that the act of thinking logically cannot possibly be natural to the human mind. If it were, then mathematics would be everybody's easiest course at school, and our species would not have taken several millennia to figure out the scientific method." End quote.
Wow.
I think it makes some reasonable points.
Absolutely. So his statement does contain a critical thinking aspect. If someone were to argue that logical thinking was inherent to humans, we could start by considering what would we expect from humans. And Tyson argues that we would expect math to be intuitively simple and the scientific method to be a natural emergence as humans developed and evolved. So, this idea that like what we know now about humans and what the expectation here are two different things, right? Like we would expect humans to be able to do this stuff if critical thinking were naturally occurring, but we know it's not because math is hard.
Yes, really clearly evidenced by how many people struggle with and dislike math and how we're still trying to like directly teach and help impart the scientific method, which by itself took a lot of sort of trial and error to develop in the way that it did.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, critical thinking is difficult. It requires extensive ongoing practice and is often not particularly fast. And the not particularly fast part can be kind of an issue because it is really easy and really fast to spout nonsensical, misleading misinformation. And there's this quote that I've heard that I couldn't find who it's attributed to exactly, but it's, quote, "A lie can travel around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes," end quote.
Yeah.
But the idea being that, like, the amount of effort it takes to get a lie going is very, very low. And it takes a long time to, like, really get to a good, solid truth. And so lies can be spreading like wildfire while we're out there with eyedroppers trying to put it out. You know,
right?
It's a hugely complex battle that those of us who are engaged in the critical thinking, skepticism side of things are sort of constantly up against.
Yeah, it's exhausting being a scientist, you know?
Yeah.
Now, we are easily beguiled by arguments that sound coherent. And amazingly, a statement that is completely nonsense can sound like an argument that makes sense as long as you don't stop to think about it. So let's take an example of a group of people calling themselves health practitioners who argue that their particular form of medicine can be used to treat any ailment, and that the reason that other doctors don't like it is because they want to charge you as much as they can for their more invasive medicine that will actually keep you sick, right? So the idea is, I'm a health practitioner. I say, I can cure everything, but nobody wants you to know about it because they want to charge you more.
Yeah, but what does beguiled mean?
Oh, that's a good word. Beguiled means, if I'm going based on my understanding of the definition, is when you decide to cosplay as Guile from Street Fighter.
That does make sense in the context of what we're saying here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when somebody applies the makeup to you, you have been guiled. So beguile means to charm or enchant someone, sometimes in a deceptive way.
Yeah, so it's sort of hooking you in, if you will. It's you sort of lure someone into believing something by tricking them.
Yes.
So anyway, we're going back to this example we had about these people who say, "Hey, I've got the cure to everything. You know, just come over to me and I'll get it to you. The doctors don't want you to have it because they're trying to keep you sick, etc." Okay. Now, many of us will hear this and immediately think that's dumb. I know what you're up to, but I think for a lot of people, this argument will sound fairly reasonable. If someone had a better cure for a disease than the medical establishment did, then we could reasonably suppose that would then threaten the financial stability of the medical establishment, who might then try and combat that financial threat, that treatment or whatever, by discrediting it as something that doesn't work. So, like, you could sort of see what looks like the tendrils of logic embedded in that.
Right. So when you go further, these quote unquote health practitioners claim that doctors are just trying to get your money, but the health practitioners that are actual health practitioners are also trying to get your money, and often more of it. So the claim that one group is trying to get your money misleads you by suggesting that the other group isn't, when they definitely are. So it's saying like, oh, they're doing this, but the truth is the person that you're talking to is also doing that thing. Further, This is a little kind of off point, but often these unlicensed medical people will provide initial treatments for free or a very low cost to get you in the door, and then we'll start piling on the premium stuff once you're hooked. I mean, that's Scientology in a nutshell.
Yeah, so a lot of them, I mean, they're sort of like, don't go to those doctors. They just want to take all your money. They're going to charge you an arm and a leg. Come over to me. I'm going to, like, I have the snake oil for sale that you can buy for the low price of, $1,000. Or, as you said, they could be like, here's a free sample. This will definitely cure your, and then,
right.
You come back and buy some more when you see how effective this is. And in those instances, what they're actually relying on, and I didn't think to include in our discussion here, but is a phenomenon called the regression to the mean, which is that we tend to, wherever we find ourselves in an extreme, we tend to then revert back to sort of an average. And this is really common in health and illness, where, like, as you get sick, And when you're at sort of the height of your sickness and you're trying to find remedies, you're also probably on the way down toward recovery. And so anything you take on the road to recovery could look like it caused you to recover when you were probably just going to recover anyway because your body was already fighting it. But well-timed snake oil that falls in that period of time while you're at the height of your recovery to you feeling better will then have you feel like that was the reason you feel better, even though it had nothing to actually do with it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, speaking of snake oil, here's ads.
Okay, so don't buy the snake oil. Going back to this argument or this example that we have been piloting here in the instance of someone who's claiming to be a health practitioner having the cure for everything. Let's also unpack here the fact that we have never found any medicine that is effective for treating all ailments. And again, you can hear the sort of conspiracy theorists going, yeah, that's because they don't want you to have it so that they can keep selling you all these other drugs, etc.
Sure.
Multiple things to unpack there. But likely such a medicine doesn't exist and never will. And for one thing, a really important reason here, what is a treatment for one condition might make another condition significantly worse. The pathologies can be so different across these different conditions as to be basically the opposite, so that anything meant to alleviate the symptoms of one would actually exacerbate the symptoms of another, because the spectrum of problems that we can have is vast, and many of them lie on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right. So let's take the simple example of temperature. Someone who's having a heat stroke needs to have their temperature lowered. Someone who is suffering from hypothermia needs their body temperature increased. What would work for someone suffering from excessive heat would kill someone suffering from hypothermia. So there is no panacea in that situation.
Exactly. Yeah. There are just some things that are counter recommended. And so it's like it's unlikely we're ever going to find anything that works for everything, because for some things that the effect that medicine has would be therapeutic in some contexts and the opposite of therapeutic in others.
Right.
Or counter therapeutic is the other way of saying that.
Right.
But I mean, that's just a fact of how things work. I mean, we just don't have cures for everything. And that's true outside of medicine as well. Now, finally, here, medical interventions used by licensed doctors are vetted over decades and hundreds of studies replicated by many different doctors around the world. Okay, like that is how that general field has evolved. Really, all science-based fields have evolved this way. So the strategies they use are then supported by a preponderance of evidence. And it is unreasonable to suppose that most or many doctors are so greedy for money that that every single one of them, they don't want to actually help people's condition. Not to mention the fact that most people who get their help from a licensed doctor do in fact show improvement. And so all this is to say that, like, to believe that every one of these doctors is trying to keep effective medicine out of the hands of their patients is a very cynical view of doctors. And I think it requires a suspension or a suspension of our disbelief about but all of them, every one of them, all of them, really?
Yeah, every one of them?
Like even half of them? Like that's so many. Like there are gonna be some people who got into this just to help people. And if they found out about this, then they would be, easily pushing this as the cure-all. And so many doctors will jump ship from the medical establishment to go over on the other side of things, but it's because they're trying to sell snake oil, because they can make a lot more money that way, because they're not hampered by things like evidence and insurance and requirements of efficacy. So like they can sell things cheaper, they can do them faster, they can make promises that they can't keep because they're no longer licensed, right? But then we also look at the fact that, like you're saying, oh, well, these doctors are just trying to keep you sick. I'm like, then why do most people get better when they go to see the doctor? Because that's what mostly happens.
One thing I want to kind of point out at this point too is think about how long it took us to unpack that statement of, I'm a health practitioner and I can sell you this cure when these other doctors want to make money. Like, think about all of the logic and all of the understanding and all of the information that we just had to gather just to make the argument, the simple argument, that why would any doctor want you sicker? right? And so that is kind of the I think maybe the kryptonite that attacks critical thinking in the grand scheme of humanity. Is it took that much time just to unpack a simple statement that most of us probably already know, but there are a lot of people that don't believe that.
Yeah.
Right.
Very good point. Yeah. Great job. I think latching on to that the prime example of the argument we made right up front is that how difficult it is to combat misinformation, because misinformation has no obligations.
Nope.
It does not have to lean on analysis or evidence. Matter of fact, it is hampered by it.
Right.
And so it can go very, very fast, and working out why it doesn't make sense is just a longer process, as evidenced by us unpacking this one, I guess, kind of hypothetical. I mean, that is an exact thing that has happened, although I wasn't citing a specific incidence for our example. But yeah, unpacking this example here just took us a long time.
Yeah, yeah. So critical thinking is broadly accepted as a fundamentally important skill, and arguably it is the most important skill that is taught in high school and college, and our world is full of misinformation and people attempting to manipulate, trick, and scam others. And it's evolving as we develop new technologies and we develop new ways to communicate. That starts to kind of evolve and change a lot more. If you've ever gotten a text from a Nigerian prince, then you know that has moved from the email format.
Evolution right there.
Yep, that's it. That is advancement at its finest.
Yeah, and I know that I've read some studies before that showed that essentially people who go to the more education they receive, the better they are at critical thinking, generally speaking. Again, it's not universally true. You go to like Trump University, you will definitely leave worse than when you arrived.
That's true.
But most of the time, the more education you receive, the better you will be at this. And you could also be very good at this without having received direct training from an education institution as well. So, and it's actually an important part of this here is that critical thinking is, I think, one of the greatest tools we have for advancing our culture, our politics, our technology, and even our species more generally speaking. Critical thinking is even useful in like financial decision making. It is just good. Everything about it is just good.
Right.
And it is accessible to everyone, and it is free if we make it accessible to everyone, which I think largely people have tried to make this accessible to everybody. But like, you don't have to buy critical thinking, right? Like, you can learn it. Part of what we're doing here today is to provide this to be accessible and to be free.
Right.
And so, yeah, that is just one of the beautiful things about it, I think, is that I would make the case that I think critical thinking is as close to a panacea as we're going to get for the problems that plague our species that are related to our own behavior.
Right.
Because there are definitely plenty of threats to our species that are not related to our own behavior, like sharks. Not just kidding. Sharks are wonderful. Don't do bad things to sharks.
Sharks are great. Leave them alone.
Asteroids. Let's go with that. Asteroids are a big threat.
Yes.
But we can do this. We can teach critical thinking. Anybody can do it, and they can do it for free.
Right. So one of the fundamental underlying issues in the divisiveness of so many groups, though, in the world, and this is an argument that we can make, is that there is a lack of critical thinking by one or both sides of many issues. So you've got folks on one side of an issue, folks on another side of an issue, or people are just not communicating in a way that allows for critical thinking to bloom and blossom and create these kind of unique spaces where people can actually have conversations about the problem at hand.
And it's hard. And there are bad actors who don't want us to think critically. They don't want to engage in critical thinking because they can exploit weaknesses by essentially, well, we'll get to some of the strategies that they use specifically, but they'll exploit those vulnerabilities in our own reasoning and logic and trick us because they know that there are so many people who don't know how to avoid being exploited and tricked and hoodwinked by these entities and their nefarious motivations.
Right.
And so that's why another reason that we think it's so important that we communicate this as effectively and consistently as we can, because there are prevailing circumstances that are going to motivate people to try and swindle other people. That is just part of the network of systems that we have built, capitalism included, although it's not the only one, where we have incentivized trying to take advantage of others. And one way to do that is to trick them into believing things that we say that are not true or are misleading.
Right.
Critical thinking is a guard against this. Critical thinking is the vaccine against misinformation, and it is the treatment against the sort of brainwashed hordes of people who have been looped into conspiracy theories and whatnot.
Right. Absolutely. So I think that begs the question, if it's such an important tool and everybody has the capability of doing it, how do we do this? Like, where do we start? How do we do this? What does critical thinking look like? And how can we just take some time to practice it even?
Yeah. And I mean, one of the ways to not do it is ads. Okay. So let's go to a discussion I'm going to lovingly call How to Critical Think. And mostly there's some sort of subsections here where we're going to talk about some specific strategies that you can use to help you be better at critical thinking or help teach other people critical thinking. And the first one is so massively important that if you leave this episode with nothing else, remember this one single point and you'll be doing better than most people. And that is, consider that you might be wrong about something that you think or believe.
Right. So one of the most general and important skills in critical thinking is considering that you might be wrong. This is thinking about thinking. And that idea of thinking about thinking is called metacognition. So it's super meta, if you get it. Like, it's like you're thinking about thinking, and then when you're thinking about the fact that you're thinking about thinking, and it turns into just layers and layers of things. But if you're interested in being a critical thinker, then learn to start asking yourself in good faith, why do I think this is the right answer? What information and evidence supports my answer? What would a counter argument be? What other explanations could there be for this? And similar questions like that. So basically what you're asking is, what makes me think I'm right, and what could prove that I'm wrong?
Yes. That simple exercise is something that most people do not do in their sort of day-to-day activity or ever, really.
Right.
And it is one of the biggest game changers you could possibly engage in. Ask, in what way could I be wrong? Why do I think that I am right? What evidence do I have, etc.? And the simple exercise is more than most people know how to do and is a substantial game changer in elevating your ability to be wrong less often. So if you're trying to be right more and wrong less, use this tool. It will get you there, at least part of the way.
Right.
An important part of this is that you do actually challenge yourself with an open mind that you could discover that you're wrong. Because if you just say to yourself, why do I think I'm right? Because I am. Like, then you won't learn anything new.
Right.
Right. You will only learn by being open to the idea that you could be wrong about kind of anything, really.
Right. So play the game of, if the opposite were true, would I also be in support of this? So, for instance, when the hosts at Fox News suspected that Taylor Swift might endorse a Democratic candidate, they said, quote, she should just stay out of politics. Of course, what if Taylor Swift was going to endorse their candidate? Would they still argue that she should stay out of politics? They then went and celebrated public endorsements from people like Kid Rock, who endorsed the Bawa to Ba candidate. And so it is not the fact that she is involved in politics. It's that they don't want her to endorse someone else, but they are pretending it's about her being involved in politics as a public figure. So the idea that we just said is the opposite true, or like, could I support this if the opposite were true? Then you see that argument falls apart right away because it doesn't serve that person for being quote unquote right.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say, like, it's the principle of the thing. And sometimes that's absolutely true. Sometimes it is the principle of the thing that's the reason that they believe something or another. But just like, if that's true, then the opposite circumstance would apply and you'd still be in support of that conclusion, right?
Right.
So that's a useful aspect about this, is just constantly thinking, what if the opposite were true? Again, and more than anything here, if you leave here with nothing else, it is, what makes me think I'm right? What could prove me wrong? Like asking those questions And again, in good faith, if you ask them just thinking like, well, I am right, so what could make me right? Probably nothing. Like, you really haven't actually done this. So if you're not going to do it, then like, don't do it. Like, you already are where you are. Like, let's not pretend you're doing critical thinking when you're not. But like, if you are actually interested in getting better at this, and this is not just for your own sake, like it is, I think, I prefer to be right more often than I am wrong, but being wrong helps me learn, right? So I accept that is like, I'm going to be wrong about things.
Right.
But like, for yourself, you get to be right more often, but also like, people will exploit this in you if you are unwilling to challenge yourself. Like, they will find ways to manipulate you by leaning on the fact that you would be unwilling to consider that you might be wrong, and then telling you some piece of information that's not really something you'd heard before, and so you have no reason to think it's not necessarily true.
Right.
And then you just accept it.
Right.
So like, probably the most important thing that we could possibly tell you today. But there are some more strategies that can help round out the comprehensiveness of your critical thinking toolbox.
Yes. So another thing is checking your sources. Relatedly, an aspect of critical thinking is using information and evidence to arrive at and support an opinion. Find evidence, then find more evidence. After you find that evidence, find more evidence.
Yeah.
Follow the citations and the sources, back up the information from multiple different sources, not just from the same source. And the more corroborating evidence, the more, I'll use this term before too, it's not corroboration, but I can't think of what the word is, but I've heard you use this phrase before, where basically everything aligns. The more evidence you have, the more corroborating evidence you have, the more from more independent sources, the more sure you can be of your position. Basically saying, if you can get the same answer from multiple sources, then you're probably more likely right. If you've got consensus, that's the word I'm looking for. Consensus across multiple reliable resources
that are independent from one another. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And just as important as finding that evidence is evaluating the quality of that evidence. So it is worth asking, does this source have an agenda? Right? If you're looking at a study by Coca-Cola that says that dentists recommend drinking Coca-Cola and Coca-Cola will improve all of your health outcomes, and they're the ones who published and funded the study, there's a good chance you maybe shouldn't believe it. It runs counter to the evidence of which we are familiar. And it also is like from a source that very clearly has a biased agenda, right?
Right.
Now, to be fair, most sources that are providing some kind of information do have some sort of agenda. They'll definitely have some kind of bias. Everyone, not just some of them, all of them. Okay.
Right.
But knowing what the bias is, what their agenda is, can help you qualify that evidence. So again, if I had the journal Coke, published by Coke, sponsored by Coke, and conducted by Coke, that says that Coca-Cola was good for you, then that is something that's going to convince me much less than a separate study from a medical journal from medical professionals who then reach some, like, let's just say this was like published in the journal Nature, and they come out, or JAMA, one of the medical journals.
Yeah.
They come out and they say, no, Coke actually is better for your teeth. That is now an independent, separate source that is not being funded by a conflict of interest. Now, they have their own agendas, sure, but we do now have multiple people, and we can try and figure out what their agenda might be, particularly if we find out that it just so happens to be that one of the authors' name is Coca-Cola. Otherwise, like, we now have more independent sources. And so just because the source have an agenda doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it can help elucidate what the bias might be and what it is,
Yeah.
And it's also worth asking if the source is generally considered a reliable source. If it is generally contradictory to most widely accepted evidence and sources, or as you mentioned, consensus, right? Is like the consensus of people say this, but then this one fringe person over here says something different. And then that's the person you choose to listen to for some reason.
Right.
Like, so if it's contradictory, and then again, if it's logically and internally consistent, those are other things to consider in terms of your evidence as far as whether or not this is probably good evidence. Like, does this make sense with things that I already know? Is this like logically consistent within itself? Are they contradicting themselves in their various statements? Like, the arguments from the anti-climate change crowd have said things like, climate change isn't real and it is good. And I'm like, if it is good, then you believe it's real. If it's not real, then I don't know how you could think that is good.
Right.
Like those two things don't work together. Like you got to pick a lane. So that's, I think, an example sometimes of where like they will spout a lot of things that they sound like real arguments, but if you stop and think about them just a little tiny bit, like they are no longer even internally consistent with themselves. So anyway, that's kind of a side tangent. The point being here is look at the source of your evidence, consider their bias, try and figure out what their agenda is.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. Another thing you could do is embrace nuance. And many, if not most, arguments frame the discussion in two extremes or binary arguments. Either something is right or wrong. It's either all this way or all that way. However, sometimes aspects of both arguments are correct. And we've seen that multiple times. And if two parties, let's talk about politics for a second. If two parties are arguing over a topic about which they both believe, feel strongly about, it may be the case that both of them have some valid arguments that don't necessarily negate one another. Like I kind of talk about this a lot when it comes to politics. Most of the time, when it comes to like certain policies, I would imagine that people who are arguing in good faith are probably trying to get to the same solution, which is the betterment of people, right?
Yeah.
That's generally what people are arguing. They just have different ways to go about that, and there might be multiple solutions or a collection of solutions that work together to make that work. Right. The nuance is really what makes the difference, right? Like in that piece, that ability to look at multiple bits of information and accept that not everything is all right or all wrong. There is some like levels and variations inside of that. But that's what Paul Offit says, right? That's the whole thing about Paul Offit. It's like part of the reason that science communicators have such a hard time is because they cannot deal in absolutes, because science never deals in absolutes unless it's like a law.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, is that we'll often couch things in the context of mostly, or we think that, or it could be the case that, and like that's how we set up the framing of our discussion points. And the opposite side is saying this is 100% this way all the time, always, no matter what. And so we're sort of often like, on the one hand, I'm like, you actually, part of what you said is technically accurate, taken out of context. Skewed a little bit, but like there's an aspect of this that's kind of correct. Well, people have already lost it. They're like, wait a minute, you said they're right, so I'm moving on.
Right.
And also like everything they said is wrong, except there's an aspect of this that's like technically kind of true. Just that sentence alone, you've like lost your audience, right?
Right.
But the truth of the matter is that there is nuance. Like there are aspects most of the time of both sides that have something true. Now there are people that are bad actors who act in bad faith, who actually have nothing valid to say.
Right.
Like the flat earth argument. There's literally nothing that like they contradict themselves. There's nothing that there's no evidence they've ever brought. It doesn't make any sense anywhere across the entire spectrum. There's nothing that they contribute to the conversation that is like actually a valid point that they make ever. It's all right. It's one of the reasons it's so confounding to me, because I was like, most other things I could like start to understand like what aspects of this can I learn something new from, where you're making a point, I should consider the validity of that point. But there's this one niche little thing, the flat earth thing, where I'm like, every single thing that you think and say is wrong. Like just flat wrong.
Yeah, just flat wrong. Like not even roundly
no,
incorrect.
not spherically wrong, not a spheroid, you know.
That argument, I'm so glad that you bring that one up, because like there are small elements that are nuanced things that like you could partially call right. Like not that the earth is flat, but part of the arguments that happen inside of that is they say, oh, well, the government is not telling you all of the information. Sure, the government doesn't tell you. There's a lot of things that the government does not tell you. That part is true. They're not hiding that the earth is flat, but there is that kind of nuance of like, yes, you don't have access to all the information that the government would possibly have about certain things.
Right.
Like that part is true.
Okay.
Right. So like, that's the thing that kind of like, people will say, when you get into conspiracy theories, there's always like a small nugget of truth somewhere in some way and some aspect, but the rest of it is just totally blown out of proportion and ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and actually that very argument is a logical fallacy, which we will be unpacking in a moment.
Yes.
To say like, oh, well, the earth is flat because the government is hiding this information from you. I'm like, the fact that they're hiding information doesn't make the earth flat, but okay.
Right.
That other thing that's unrelated to the first thing that you said does have some accuracy to it.
Right, exactly.
So ultimately here, it's important to consider diverse perspectives. Even if you disagree or expect to disbelieve the other points, it is good just to hear what is said. And this is part of why I have watched and read a bunch of the Flat Earth things, is because now I have heard their side and can speak with confidence that they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
This does not mean that all arguments should be considered equally. If we're discussing climate change and one of the arguments is that it is being caused by satanic aliens on a cocaine bender, then we can listen to that, look at the abundant lack of evidence, and throw this on the way too unlikely to be true pile of nonsense that gets thrown into that discussion. Because it's so easy to spend a ton of time dismantling arguments, no matter how asinine they are, and then getting nowhere because we're spending all of our time debunking those arguments, which is actually a strategy that people will use when they're trying to spread misinformation, is to just fire hose misinformation at you. So you don't actually have a chance to make any valid points. You're just taking down the things that they're lying about as quickly as they possibly can.
Right. Absolutely. There are some people who will just flood the discussion with a lot of these unlikely scenarios so as to waste everybody's time debunking nonsense just to avoid having a real conversation about the issues. And this is super counterproductive. It slows down or prevents real discourse. This is called sea lioning. It's a common strategy of Tucker Carlson, if you've ever watched anything that he's ever done. He just floods the discussion with an avalanche of nonsense that does not make any sense, that throws you off on how to argue or what to talk about. You kind of okay, well, but I'm going to go back to the point that we were talking about 10 points ago, but now you've thrown 15 different unrelated things at me, and I have to now debunk all of these things. And it's just kind of it's an awful way to have a discussion.
Yes, exactly. And the whole point of this general section was to talk about looking for nuance. And I think we sort of devolved into, not necessarily devolved, but I think we got a little sidetracked with the fact that there are people who try and they avoid us having a conversation about nuance because then eventually you'd arrive at a position that is not one that they agree with. But nuance is very important because, as we said, it tends to be the case that in good faith arguments, people on both sides who feel strongly probably have some valid points that they're making.
Right.
And at some point, it might come down to a values judgment where it's you're right if the value that you have is this, but that's not the value that I have. So that's why I think that this is wrong. And that's okay. There's really you're at an impasse because you're just going to have to agree that we don't agree on this value and that therefore it entails different conclusions. But even landing at that place is, I think, a much better place to be.
Right. Absolutely.
The value decreases significantly when you insert ads. So let's go to our next thing that to help with critical thinking, which is considering the assumptions and implications of an argument.
Yes. So when you hear or make a claim or an argument, it tends to have a built-in assumption and some implications. So what you should start trying to do is identify the assumption in the arguments you hear. This is called the unstated premise or the enthymeme, which is just so many soft sounds in that word. There was a health practitioner who argued that people should walk barefoot by moonlight so that your feet can absorb moonbeams. Now, there are a few unstated assumptions here. 1, that moonbeams can be deposited in the ground. 2, that they can be absorbed through the soles of your feet. 3, that this is something missing from our daily activity. And 4, that this is somehow supposed to be healthful. So inside of that, walking barefoot by moonlight should be good for you. Should be good for your health. It's all when you really unpack that argument, you go, oh, there's a lot to be said in just telling people to walk barefoot to get moonbeams.
Yeah. And also consider some implications. Even if let's just pretend that any part of what they said was right. Even if walking by moonlight could absorb some moonbeams through the sole of our feet, does the benefits gained from this thing that no one is doing outweigh the risks of the potential for stepping on something that could seriously injure your feet? Like getting a cut or a scrape or tetanus or something like that.
But also, isn't it worth it to take a second to go, what is a moonbeam but a reflected sunbeam? Isn't that just...
That is also truly an unstated aspect of this. It's just reflected light. It's just reflected light. If you shine, it'd be does the property of light change substantially when it hits a mirror or a surface that happens to be light colored? No.
No. But there are people that buy into this, right? So, in a conversation that we've had before, and where we expressed some skepticism about someone's self-diagnosis, the response that was received was that the person, quote, this is a direct quote from them, they would know if their mind works differently than other people, end quote. And when you hear this, it's pretty easy to flag the implication that this would mean that the person would have to know how everyone else's mind works to know that theirs was different. So in that case, this person should definitely be a world-renowned detective, because that is an ability no human has ever had before. Like, it's one of those things where when somebody makes an argument based on like knowing something without having the experience or the backing or any of those things, then you kind of have to take a second and go like, really? Is that really what we're doing now, you know?
A significant amount of the arguments I have found myself in, there are a lot of unstated assumptions that are implied by the arguments or statements that people are making. And like those alone take a while to like dig in on and figure out what's going on. It renders the rest of their argument basically moot because the position from which they're starting is nonsense.
Right.
So it's like you can grow something that looks like reason out of nonsense, but it is still nonsense because it starts from nonsense and it only sounds like words that make a sentence that you can understand.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, it is so common. I wish I had more examples like just right off the top of my head, but there are a lot of these premises, and this happens a lot in political discourse, especially where someone's making some point about some policy or something, and they'll state something that embedded in that thing, there are assumptions and implications that they are choosing to ignore for the expediency of making a point that they're hoping you won't question.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. The last major strategy here is kind of, it could be potentially a long one, but we'll just try and zip through it as efficiently as we can, which is to avoid making logical fallacies and also be on the lookout for people who are making logical fallacies to persuade you to believe something.
Right. So we have covered a few different logical fallacies on the show before, and it would be worth unpacking many of them in more detail with examples at some point. And these are arguments in which they are logically incorrect or poor, although they often sound reasonable on the surface.
So engaging, like using logical fallacies is a really good way to be wrong really fast. If you're trying not to be right, logical fallacies is definitely the way to go. Versus if you are trying to be right, logical fallacies is not the way to go.
Right.
Even when they would be expedient to do so, like just don't. It'll hurt you in the long run. They're also really not particularly difficult to dismantle. So avoid using them in your own arguments, and then notice when people are using them themselves, because they do it a lot. Maybe, dare I say, most of the time when they're making some argument, it seems to have at least one, if not many, embedded logical fallacies.
Right. So it is equally important to recognize that you're doing this, but also to recognize when somebody else is making these arguments or using these arguments to try to beguile you into believing or accepting something demonstrably false. So we're going to go over a brief list of some common logical fallacies with brief descriptions so that we can go into this and maybe some more episodes later or some different minis and whatnot.
All right, so we're going to cover 3 quick ones that you're likely to run into. The first one is an ad hominem attack. This one's actually become so much better recognized that I've even heard them discuss this on the news. So I think that people are becoming more aware of this. This is tantamount to name calling. This is basically just saying something mean about your opponent rather than addressing their argument. So if someone's making some points and maybe making good points, the opponent might say, "Yeah, well, I'm better looking than you." That would be an ad hominem. Because you're not even talking about the argument. You're just attacking them as a person. Like, there's something I don't like about you. You're too old. You laugh too much. Your skin is too dark, whatever. And so it's sort of an attempt to discredit your opponent, I guess. But you're just attacking them, not their arguments. So it's called an ad hominem logical fallacy.
There's also straw man argument. This is presenting an argument that the opposing side is not actually making and then attacking that argument. So let's say one person argues that there should be regulations on health supplements, and their opponent says, you think we should take away people's right to make medical choices for themselves. This is not the argument the first person was making, but now that becomes a subject of the discussion, and the person that was originally talking now has to backtrack to try to go, whoa, that's not what I was saying, and the other person is already moving ahead and just moving quickly and steamrolling them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it is reframing an argument that someone is not actually making as their argument. We actually saw this a lot when we were doing our research for the Electoral College episodes. The people who were in favor of supporting the Electoral College would often use strawman arguments to try and fight against the other side, and also like employ tactics that were like based on nothing. Anyway, not worth relitigating that. The next one to talk about here is called the red herring. This is also basically the same as whataboutism. I think some people would separate them, but they're very, very similar. So we're going to group them together here.
Right.
And a red herring is, if people are familiar with this, this is a term that gets used periodically, but it's using a misleading question or argument to distract away from the actual argument. It's a distraction is basically the best way to put it. It's a way to try and literally mislead people away from whatever other thing you don't want them to pay attention to is.
Right.
So when one person says something such as, quote, talking about joy is inappropriate when there are so many terrible things going on in the world, end quote. Don't know where I got that one. We can both try to promote optimism and joy and acknowledge that there are terrible things going on in the world. Like, just because there are terrible things going on in the world doesn't mean we can't also sometimes have joy. Like, people will lose important members of their family, and then one day again they'll still experience smiling and happiness, and even though that it ruined their lives generally, like moment to moment they will have fleeting instances of this. So like, we can do both of those things at the same time.
Right. Or when someone challenges a candidate by saying something like, you've been accused and convicted of corruption, how would you address that, or how do you address that with your voters? And the candidate responds with, we'll address all instances of corruption in our government, and I have a plan to create more jobs and eliminate illegal immigration. The response doesn't follow from the original question, so it doesn't really answer anything. My mom just said this the other day, which is basically like, you just said a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't answer the question. It didn't do anything. It's like when you go to a restaurant and you're like, we've been on the list for a long time. How long is the wait? And the person says, oh, we've got a little bit of a wait. It shouldn't be too long now.
Yeah.
That's not an answer.
That's true. But it'd be more of an example of a red herring if they said something to the effect of, have you noticed how nice the weather is for outside today? Or I don't know. That's not a good one. That's not a good example.
Yeah. It'd be like, what about ism? It'd be like, okay, I know you're waiting. What about all these other people who are waiting?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. It's like, okay, they are waiting and I'm still waiting.
Right. Yeah. You didn't answer my question.
And my question really was just, how much longer am I going to be waiting?
Right.
Yeah, this is another super common tactic I hear a lot in political discourse. That's a lot of the whataboutism and the redirecting. So like, this is a question I don't want to answer, so instead I'm going to answer this other one. Now, most savvy politicians, this is totally an aside, but most savvy politicians, when they get like the sort of the question where they don't want to have to answer the question, they'll shift the conversation to something that they do want to talk about, just as you said, like, oh, what I'm going to do is create more jobs. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
But the corruption, though.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is how there's been a handful of politicians lately who they'll get asked like a softball question with an easy answer to make them look good. And instead they'll go on this weird ranty tirade about something completely unrelated that makes them look petty and stupid. And, and that has definitely been a thing that's been going on.
I've seen a few where somebody will they'll just outright say, what about this? Like, somebody will talk about, universal health care, and another politician will just say something like, well, what about Venezuela? It's like, well, what about Venezuela? We're we're talking about United States health care. We're not talking about Venezuelan health care. We're not politicians. Like, I've seen that come up, and you're like, wow, what a turn.
Yeah.
Like, it is wild to just throw that, just like have that in your back pocket and be like, what about this? Like, it's almost like a Cards Against Humanity, but like for political debates.
Yeah, fair. So that's another comment. There are many, many logical fallacies that are worth spending some time on and diving into examples and why they're bad arguments, and how to avoid making them, and how to recognize when you're being tricked by them, because people do depend on these. And again, they're not actually acting in good faith. They're just trying to manipulate the situation.
Right.
So an aspect of this conversation I was thinking about when putting this together was considering, I think, the people who have been the victims of this a lot. And then also considering how this shows up in politics, how it shows up in medicine, how it shows up in conspiracy theories, that sort of thing. But there's another aspect of this, which is there are a lot of people who think they're doing critical thinking, who are definitely not, who have sort of tricked themselves. So there's some kind of pitfalls that we're going to go over really quickly to help you avoid making the mistake of sort of trapping yourself into a non-critical thinking sphere. But we're going to trap you in some ads. All right, let's talk about some of the pitfalls to avoid to make sure you're not believing you're doing critical thinking when you actually are not.
It's really easy to feel like you are doing the work to learn about something when all you are actually trying to do is find more people and sources that agree with your predisposed opinions. So basically, like, it's when you say, I'm doing the research, but all you do is look up Breitbart and Fox News, and you're like, that's actually not research, first and foremost. But second of all, you're not ever reading any sort of other opinions or other things out there, or just like actual science.
Exactly.
Read that.
Exactly. Yes. It is the tendency to just look for things that you already agree with. It's easy to do. Man, it's complicated because when you're right, most things that you find will agree with you. And when you're wrong, it's easy to find things that do agree with you, even though they are wrong. And so there's an aspect of this evaluating the quality of the evidence. What's their agenda? Ask yourself, could you be wrong? How could you be wrong? All of those things. That's, again, how you sort of help get around this. But there are a lot of people who think that they're in the know because they read a bunch of stuff and think that now they've got all this secret information that most people don't have.
Right.
And again, like, that does happen sometimes. Like, there legitimately are instances where people have more information than other people have. But I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of believing that you have something that most people don't have, and then not actually questioning that and not actually considering that you might be wrong and that you might be being misled by somebody.
Right.
So it's really easy to believe that you are thinking critically because you're accepting fringe beliefs that are touted as being the truth. And part of what they do when they're trying to capture people like this is they're going to tell you you're really smart. They're like, only the few handful of really smart people accept and know that this is the truth because everyone else is so dumb. And people do have the tendency to estimate themselves as being above average on everything. And so they're going to resonate with that. They're going to hear this and say, I am smart. I'm one of those smart people who can hear this and believe it. And the people who are like trying to manipulate you, like, they don't actually think you're smart.
Right.
Actually, they probably think you're not specifically, but they know that they can manipulate you. But it's easy to fall into that trap of being told that you're smart and that like only a handful of people know the truth and you're one of those lucky few. And when you read that on like a conspiracy theory website, then like that's a good red flag that you've gone the wrong way.
Right, absolutely. So like what they'll do is they'll tell you you're smart for believing them, and then even smarter than everyone else who doesn't. And they'll tell you that they have information that others don't. They don't want you to have because they don't want you to know the truth. They will lie so much that it makes you question the truth. They will flood the conversational arena with so much information that people think that they can't trust any sources. Their only goal is to sow chaos, to dismantle the institutions that have developed in the current status, to squeeze money or loyalty out of people to do their dirty work for them. This is one of the things that leads to cults.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's difficult because, again, nuance, there's so much nuance here. There are governments in the world that have taken on misinformation campaigns to try and convince their citizens to believe only what the government tells them.
Right.
Those are established institutions with a lot of clout, a lot of authority, and potentially a lot of reason to believe that they're telling you the truth.
Right.
They're definitely lying. there are other governments and institutions in the world that have worked really hard to try and dispel myths and try and portray facts and have made mistakes and then admitted to those mistakes and then tried to correct those mistakes. But all people heard was, I made a mistake.
Right.
So there's a lot of these elements of things where it's like, it is true that sometimes big, massive institutions lie, like some of these governments that are trying to convince their people of certain things. I think it's generally reasonable to assume that a lot of the time the government lies about some things, but how much and to what extent and exactly what that lie consists of is going to vary a lot.
Right.
Like using a Sharpie to draw on a map of where a hurricane is going to go without consulting meteorological experts is a very stupid lie that's demonstrably false and could get a lot of people hurt.
Right.
Versus something like misleading people about how good or bad something is going in the general trends of the country or whatever.
Right.
So anyway, those are, I think some considerations here is that like there are people who all they want to do is they want to sow chaos, because if everything sort of crumbles down, then they can seize power and resources and money, and they can carve out a little niche for themselves, potentially a large niche for themselves, where then they can be sort of self-secure.
Right.
It's just one of the strategies people have employed, but it is one that's out there. And then there are people who just like, they know that they can manipulate people better if they get people to just distrust everyone. And then they come forward with confidence, with money, with resources, with promises. And so while everyone else is in chaos, they show up as a shining beacon of hope, even though they're the ones that started that chaos, so that by contrast, they can look like confident, shining beacons of hope.
Right.
And like those people are out there too. So it's tough. Like we live in a world where people are trying to mislead one another. And the best tool we can have is to try and employ our critical thinking strategies against this so that we can weigh and evaluate the evidence we receive and judge it on those merits. Like,
right.
You know, we think of like big giant companies like oil companies who knew about the climate crisis for decades in advance of that being like widely accepted public knowledge. And they buried that information and lied about it and then engaged in misinformation campaigns to try and get people to not believe it.
Right.
And so that's one of those entities where it's like, this is a major established institution that has a lot of data about this and is saying this thing. And the truth is like that they are trying to mislead you. And so again, it's complicated, but it's always worth being on the defensive to try and avoid being hoodwinked by people who are trying to get you. And so again, critical thinking is our best tool against this, I think.
So ultimately, I think the point that we kind of land on is being a critical thinker means being open-minded, but also being skeptical. So like you want to learn stuff, but you also have to question the resources. Being closed-minded is being unwilling to accept evidence that challenges your belief. And I always think of a friend of mine who said this at a show one time. We were playing a show, and he was the singer of a band, and he said, every now and again, you should challenge your beliefs to see if they still hold water. Yeah. Like you should question what you think to see if it still holds water. And the truth is because things change. Science changes. Like, I mean, the fact that we've got a lot of people here who grew up with 9 planets in the solar system, you learn that we really only have 8 major planets and 5 dwarf planets. It blows your mind. So you have to be careful with you have to be open-minded and be prepared to learn new information and to seek resources and do all the thing and be able to evaluate those resources in a really meaningful way.
And just saying that you are without actually doing that and actively pushing the alternative agenda, RFK, is not being an actual skeptical, critical thinker. So just keep that in mind as well.
Yes.
A point that I was thinking about, like there was someone who was interviewing some people at, let's just say a rally, and that person was lamenting, they're like, how come all these people go to college? He's like, all the people I know that went to college are voting for this candidate, and the people who didn't go to college are voting for this candidate. And you feel like you know where the next logical step of that argument would go, and instead what this person said makes you wonder what they're teaching at those colleges. They're teaching them to be woke.
Yeah.
I'm like, mostly what you're learning is critical thinking. And critical thinking just does not facilitate certain ways of thinking about things.
Right.
But way to say the quiet part out loud, I guess. At least part of it. You almost got there.
You were so close.
Yeah. You started to see the light, and then you're like, nope, cover the eyes, darkness.
Nope. Yeah. Nope. Yep. That's one of my favorite conspiracy theories is that colleges indoctrinate liberals.
Yeah. And then they actively push to only teach like conservative curriculum. And I'm like, who's got the agenda now? Like, what are you doing?
Right. Ugh. That's a whole thing.
Anyway, that's what we have to say about critical thinking. I hope that you found some tools in here that will help you be a better critical thinker out in the world, evaluate that evidence. And to be clear, I know we poked a lot of fun at like sort of the conservative politics. People on both sides of the spectrum do all of this a lot, and it annoys me greatly.
Yeah.
And I criticize the ever-loving crap out of all of them when they do things that are not good critical thinking arguments. They make logical fallacies and they do whataboutisms. Both of them do it, and both of them are wrong when they do it.
Right.
It just so happens to be that there are certain people who do this substantially more by like orders and orders of magnitude.
Right.
They're more easy examples to point to because there's so many of them. So this is not meant really to be a directly political conversation. We are on the side of science and critical thinking, I guess is the way to say it.
Yes.
And that just happens to be in direct contrast with some political platforms more than others.
That's completely fair. I like that.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and wrap it up there. If you'd like to tell us what you think about critical thinking or how we've improved your critical thinking repertoire, you can email us directly at info@wwd.wwdpodcast.com. You can also reach us on all the social media platforms, I can say words, and speak to us there. If you would like to support what we are doing here, you can join us over on Patreon, where you'll get some access to bonus materials and early episodes and ad-free episodes and that sort of thing. You can always pick up some merch, leave us a rating and review, like, subscribe, share this on social media, or however you want to share it. Hand your phone to a friend and say, listen to this. That could work too.
Yeah.
If you do join us over on Patreon, we have a list of people that we always need to take the time to thank for their continued and ongoing support. And that is Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, and Michelle. Thank you all so much.
Yay. We love y'all.
In addition, I have my team of people who helps make this podcast happen, writing and fact-checking from Shane and myself. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, and the guy in the chair who does all the sound editing goodness is Justin. Thank you for all of that you do.
Yay, we love you too.
Thank you. And of course, thank you all for listening. Now, it sounds like we're at the end, but we're actually not, because we're going to recommend some things.
And we love recommending things.
Recommendations.
All right, so I am recommending a movie. I am such a huge fan of these movies, and it's just because I have a hard time disliking giant robots fighting each other. So the movie I'm going to recommend is Transformers: Rise of the Beasts, because I think that it's done a good job of kind of expanding the lore of the Transformers world, even though it's a prequel to like kind of the original Transformers movies.
Oh, okay.
It takes place in 1994. And it's got all of your favorites in it, and it's a lot of fun. And it also has the Beast Wars Transformers in it. So it's got Optimus Primal and Cheetor and Rhinox and all of them.
Sure.
I don't know. It's just one of those things where it's just a fun movie. Like it's just like if you go into it with very low expectations, you're going to have a blast. If you go into it expecting some high art form, you're going to be so disappointed. So don't do that. Go into it with the understanding that it is just giant robots, giant alien robots fighting each other on planet Earth. And sometimes humans show up. It's great.
This is the turn the brain off recommendation.
Just have fun with it. Don't suppress your joy. Just enjoy it. It's so fun.
Fair enough. Okay, I'm recommending a movie that came out a while back. I haven't been able to get to theaters as much these days. And so this one finally came available on streaming, and it is Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. This is the God knows whatever installment of this franchise, 9 or 10 or 100, who knows? 8?
It's the 8th one, yeah.
Okay,
yep.
Thank you. I was close to my very first guess.
You were so close. I mean, there's so many.
There are so many, and this is obviously Part 1. The first time they've done that in this entire series is doing a two-parter. And I don't know. These movies are so good. Like, I just like them so much. I mean, they're basically just hardcore nonstop action. That's it. Is just supposed to be keeping you on the edge of your seat, excited about what's going to happen. How are they going to get out of this situation type stuff? And they do a lot of practical action as well. they have sort of been constantly pushing the heights of how far they would make Tom Cruise fall off of things. I think they reached a pinnacle of that in the previous movie. And so they brought it down a little bit lower this time, although arguably more dangerous.
Yeah.
So a lot of stunts, but they're just good action movies, you know? They're good. They're just good.
They're very entertaining.
Yeah.
Like, they're good action spy movies, for sure.
Yeah. That's it. I mean, that's all you really want out of it. So, okay. So you recommended Transformers Rise of the Beasts. I'm recommending Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which I believe is streaming on Amazon. Do you know if Rise of the Beasts is available somewhere?
It's somewhere, but we bought it.
Oh, okay. Got you. All right. That might be available to stream somewhere or rent or purchase or whatever. So you do you. Anyway, I think that is all that we have to say. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for recording with me today. Shane, is there anything that I missed or that you'd like to add before we say our goodbyes?
Not today.
All right. Then go think critically. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
Bye.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.